There are 8 factors that are major drivers of antimicrobial resistance. For example, inappropriate use of antimicrobials, the use of antimicrobial agents in animals, poor infection control practices, inadequate surveillance for antimicrobial resistance, poor quality of antimicrobial agents in the market, inadequate and weak regulation and enforcement of laws, weak pharmaceutical management and drug promotion. For the inappropriate use of antimicrobials, we know that antimicrobial agents are one of the most widely used and misused agents. Antimicrobial availability is also increasing. This has been facilitated by recent global health initiatives like the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria, the US presidential initiatives, all which have come in to support public health initiatives or diseases that have been a priority. And up to 50% of human use of antimicrobial agents is unnecessary. Studies have indicated that every second patient in acute care hospitals receive antibiotics, and 30 to 60% of patients who've been given antibiotics in primary health care could have been unnecessary. This is perhaps twice what would have actually been required. Inappropriate use of antimicrobial agents occurs at different levels. At the prescriber level, the dispenser, and at the patient or consumer levels. There are 3 main groups that influence the inappropriate use of antibiotics, and these have been attributed to prescribing, dispensing, and consumption. Prescribing unnecessarily for antibiotics has been attributed to wrong diagnosis, which can be as a result of lack of knowledge or inadequate information for the prescribers. This would result in either an over or underdose or a wrong drug. For dispensing, either too much or too little of the prescribed drug can be dispensed. Inadequate information for the person who's carrying out the dispensing process, poor training, lack of the recommended or required drugs can also result in inappropriate use. For the consumers, lack of information can result in an over or underuse of antimicrobial agents. Lack of information can also result in using the drug when it is not required. Financial constraints play a big role in impacting antibiotic use, because the patients or the consumers would want to use what they can afford. Multiple prescribers can also result or contribute to unnecessary consumption of antimicrobial agents. At the prescriber level, the misuse of antibiotics has also been reported. For example, in the treatment of diarrhea in public and private sectors. Not all diarrheal cases are of bacterial origin. And when managing diarrheal cases, standard treatment guidelines need to be followed. And diarrhea should be treated with oral rehydration salts as often as possible. It is important to note that antibiotics and antidiarrheals are not the first choice for the treatment of diarrhea. And from the studies that have been done, what has been found out is that compliance with guidelines is very low in most public and private facilities, and most times the wrong treatment is prescribed. What what are some reasons for irrational prescribing and dispensing? Like we mentioned earlier, training deficiencies, diagnostic uncertainties, unavailability or underutilization of standard treatment guidelines or formularies, the fear of poor patient outcomes, and the need for self-reassurance by the prescribers would lead them to unnecessarily prescribe antimicrobial agents. Some prescribers fear litigation, and some also have no access to microbiological information that can guide the selection of the proper antimicrobial agent. And some prescribers also give in to patient demands. Some are under economic incentives from the drug manufacturing companies, and this is a negative influence on the prescribing practices. Prescribers are also under pressure from peer groups, either the prescribing or the pharmacy advisors. They are under pressure from the patient or parents' demands. They are also under pressure from hospital experts, and regulatory and control mechanisms also influence their prescribing practices. Looking at the misuse at dispensing and the consumption level, we know that antimicrobial agents can be purchased without a prescription in many resource-poor countries. And we also know that patients tend not to finish their course of antibiotics. And more often than not, antibiotics are used for viral infections such as common colds, coughs, or sore throats. And this all adds up to misuse of antimicrobial agents. It is important to let the general public know that antibiotics do not work on colds. Apart from inappropriate use in human beings, there is also rampant use of antimicrobial agents in animals. 50% of the antimicrobial use in developing countries is actually attributed to animals. And 40 to 80% of this animal use is highly questionable. Why are we saying this is highly questionable? Because antimicrobial agents are not used for treatment of infections in animals, but are rather used for the prevention of the occurrence of infection. And it is important to note that irrational use of antimicrobial agents in animals can contribute to resistance in human pathogens. This is because bacteria can be easily transmitted into animals, and the animals can pass the resistant genes to the animal's flora, and this can be transmitted to humans via the food chain. The other major driver of antimicrobial resistance is the lack of infection prevention and control. Infection control is key to reducing the spread of antimicrobial resistance. There is lack of or poor adherence to effective infection control protocols. If infection control is adequately practiced, then infections will not result, and the demand for antimicrobial agents will reduce. Common modes of transmission of infections include hands and medical devices. And transmission does not just include the transfer of microbes from one person to another, but it also includes the transfer of multi-drug resistant organisms from either the patients to the healthcare workers, or from the healthcare workers to the patient, and eventually into the community. And up to 10% of admitted patients get hospital-acquired infections, and 60% of these hospital-acquired infections are drug resistance. The other major driver for antimicrobial resistance is poor regulation and enforcement. And this is characterized by the lack of proper control of supply, distribution, and sale of antimicrobial agents. And this can be seen through the sale of antimicrobial agents in unofficial retail outlets or even street vendors. And when antimicrobial agents are sold without a prescription or sold in incomplete doses in most pharmacies, that is actually a breach in law and a breach in the requirements for dispensing antimicrobial agents. The other major driver of antimicrobial resistance is the presence of poor quality antimicrobial products in the market. Counterfeit and substandard drugs that lack the stated active ingredient or contain the wrong active ingredient or even have insufficient levels of active ingredient contributes to antimicrobial resistance. The US FDA has estimated that up to 10% of drugs worldwide are counterfeit, and in some countries more than 50% of the drug supply is fake. And this takes us back to our definition of antimicrobial resistance. When microorganisms are exposed to subtherapeutic levels, this actually encourages the development and the growth and multiplication of resistant strains, which ultimately will result in treatment failure and poor patient outcomes. Inadequate surveillance is an important driver for antimicrobial resistance, because when surveillance is not done, we know that there's going to be inadequate data to guide policy, to guide the use, and we cannot be able to measure the impact. The quality and dependability of data can be a concern even where this is available. And this is because we do not have a standardized reporting system for suspected cases of antimicrobial resistance. If a patient, for example, returns with a medication and says it did not work, what happens, or what is the role of the healthcare provider who comes into contact with this particular patient? In the best case, the patient is sent back to the doctor. But sometimes the staff just changes the antibiotics or gives a higher dose without proper evidence on whether or not that antibiotic is effective or they will require an alternative. So surveillance needs to be carried out within the hospital and in the community to inform best practices. The final driver for antimicrobial resistance is poor pharmaceutical management. Deficiency in pharmaceutical management manifests in many ways. For example, inappropriate selection and use of antimicrobial agents. And this can be attributed to the lack of policies and guidelines, like standard treatment guidelines or essential medicines lists, and inadequate pre- and in-service training. If drugs are not appropriately selected, then the wrong drug is likely to be prescribed for an infection. Apart from inappropriate selection, undependable supplies can also drive inappropriate use of antimicrobial agents and eventually contribute to antimicrobial resistance. More often than not, health workers will dispense an antimicrobial agent not because it was prescribed, but because that was the best available option for that particular point. And this is a direct reflection of the pharmaceutical management systems that are present in a facility. And in addition to the inappropriate selection and undependable supply, poor storage practices can compromise the quality of antimicrobial agents present in a facility. And this can also drive antimicrobial resistance when the quality of the active ingredients is compromised. Medicine advertising and promotion also plays a big role in the prescription and dispensing of antimicrobial agents, and this can occur via direct-to-consumer advertisements, which allows the marketing of medicines directly to the public. This should be discouraged because the public can make a choice that is not informed because of the limited knowledge that they have. And again, there is a stimulated demand for the latest medicine, not necessarily the most effective in terms of cost and availability. Pharmaceutical promotion also increases pressure on prescribers because this largely targets the prescribers. And the pharmaceutical companies use a host of incentives to motivate the prescribers to prefer the latest medicine. And these incentives come in the forms of gifts of free samples or even offering to support speaking engagements for the prescribers. And this does not necessarily translate to appropriate use, but because of the incentives that the prescribers have received, they will tend to prescribe a particular molecule because of what they will get in return.